Anna, thank you very much for kind introduction, and I would like to thank Alexander Institute for organizing this talk and for having us here. It was an amazing experience to be a visiting fellow there. I will miss it a lot. And before I will start sharing my presentation, I would like to make a short disclaimer for people to understand from which position I'm talking. So I'm, of course, a Ukrainian scholar, but I've been working for studying and working abroad for the last 10 years. So I was lucky to be in Slovenia when the large-scale invasion started. But before that, I also for 20 years worked at one of the Ukrainian universities, at the National University named by Ales Panchar in Dnipro. And my mother is still teaching in the same university. So, and of course, I have many fellow scholars in Ukraine and abroad now who are forced to flee. So I try to, before giving today's talk, to get more information from them, to ask about things that worry them and some challenges that they have to deal with. It is, of course, I will start sharing my screen now. It is, of course, always a great responsibility to give voice to people who are not here today. And I saw a couple of names of Ukrainian colleagues actually in the audience. So I will really appreciate if they will also drop their comments in the chat, or if they choose to speak personally. So here is the outline of my today's presentation. I will very briefly give you the information about the higher education situation in Ukraine, just for you to understand the scale of the problem, because what I face, and of course, it's probably not the problem of the audience today, but maybe for some people who will be listening to the recording, some people fail to grasp the size of our country, and therefore, of course, accordingly, the number of scholars and students and higher education institutions that we do have. And then I wanted to start on an optimistic note, tell about some practices that have been implemented already, and tell about some best cases, but also then address some challenges and problems that we already have with those practices, and maybe to point the room for improvement that could be found there. And then I will also talk about various individual and collective challenges, and I tell a couple of personal stories that I heard from my colleagues and friends. And then I will open the room, of course, to be followed by Mykhailo's comments, but also for discussion, because I have many questions which probably yet do not have enough answers to what we can do to better help our colleagues and friends in Ukraine and outside. So starting with, as I promised, the the overview of the situation in Ukraine with the higher education. On the left on the picture, you can see actually one of the buildings of the university in Kharkov that was basically completely destroyed by the bombing. And so like this, we have now more than 40 higher education institutions that are either destroyed, they don't exist anymore. I mean, the buildings are severely damaged. And altogether, more or less in Ukraine, we have 282, so closer to 300 higher education institutions. So just for you to understand the share of those that lost their material possessions, the rooms and safe spaces for students and scholars to work and study. And for now, approximate budget is evaluated to rebuild them as around $9 billion US. 74, so 1/4 more or less of higher education institutions and colleges have been relocated to a safer location. And the regions that suffered the most predictably are Kharkiv and Kharkiv Oblast, the same Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Chernihiv, and Mykolaiv. We have around 1.2 million students, and there is no information of how many of them left Ukraine, because there is no such official statistics of how many students left and how many of them actually continue studying on distance, and how many of them applied to foreign education for foreign universities. So with this information, we do not possess it. And as of most recent check, only half of the higher education institutions have bomb shelters that are of good quality enough to continue teaching offline. But also, of course, this is, I don't know even if it sounds optimistic or pessimistic, because even if the university is equipped with a bomb shelter, some cities have, airstrikes, alarms literally every hour, almost non-stop. So then the question is, even if there is a bomb shelter, what kind of education can be performed there when everybody is there? And many, of course, higher education institutions chose to continue working online, but many also do teach offline. For example, the Economy Narhos Institute in Odessa is teaching now online 2 shifts of students before and after noon. So you can imagine also now Odessa, for example, has a more peaceful situation because of the grain exports and kind of truce that exists between the sides. But I'm, for example, really disturbed and concerned about the safety of both the scholars and students there. So now, just a second to move the slide. Now to tell about some best practices that were applied immediately after the large-scale invasion started. And of course, on the first days of the large-scale invasion, we were all, like many of my colleagues abroad, contacted by people from different universities and organizations asking how to help scholars, because many scholars, as all the other Ukrainians, found themselves in need to move to safer places, either in Ukraine or abroad. And you know that we had more than 10 million of Ukrainians fleeing and crossing the border. And so one of the very successful initiatives that is there was the completely fully volunteer organization organized by early career researchers, PhD students, and some scholars, Science for Ukraine. And Science for Ukraine, which is very active until now and continue its work, what it's been doing is contacting, it has national coordinators in each country. And in some countries, there are more than one national coordinators. They contact universities and are in constant search for new positions and openings for mostly for PhD students and then for early career, senior career researchers. And then they create and maintain the database. So if you are a scholar who needs a position and who's looking for the position abroad, the Science for Ukraine database is a good place to start. And then you can apply, so that you see the link on the slide. You can apply the filters, you can look up different universities, countries, different fields, and so on. And you can also contact national coordinators for help. And this has proved to be quite an efficient tool with its limitations, of course. Another thing, which is joined again enterprise, so to say, also of hundreds of volunteers in Ukraine and abroad, which was organized by several Ukrainian scholars and activists. It's called Ukrainian Global University. You see there the titles of the organizations that put their hands and supported this initiative. It was running for several months, starting from spring this year. And there was the application for which could be used by students, for high school students who wanted to apply for university abroad, but also by students of the universities and institutes and the scholars. An idea was to first do a thorough selection of the candidates, to select candidates who are able already to go and study in the boarding schools abroad, universities abroad, or work in the universities abroad, and then match them with partner universities. And so to give you an idea of the scale of work, and I volunteered for this organization too, we had 2,500 applications, through all of which then we had to go and select the best ones. And then there were the rounds of tests, personal interviews, then second follow-up interviews, and altogether we selected 250 successful applicants who were ready to go and study in the universities abroad or work in the universities abroad. However, you see that the final result so far is not that optimistic. So out of those 250 people who were selected, only 57 actually got to real universities and went and started studying abroad. And partially, so of course, some of people actually declined the offers that they got because those were often the brightest students, so they also found some other options. But in many cases, it was also because not all the universities actually fulfilled the promises that they had. They either took less students than they promised, or they became unresponsive, and it was quite a disappointment, to tell the truth, for organizers and for people who did all this work, but mostly for the applicants who went through all those stages of the selection and had very high hopes, and in the end, are still looking for the places to go. One more initiative I wanted to mention, this is the relatively new one. This is a call that Marie Skłodowska-Curie Action is opening now for Ukraine. And in 2 days, there will be official launch and information session. So please, if you're interested in a PhD or postdoc project starting from 6 months, if I'm not mistaken, maybe less, please look it up and go attend this information session for the universities who would wish to host a Ukrainian scholar, or for the Ukrainian scholars who want to have a joint program with a foreign institution. And as far as I know, University of Helsinki is supporting this. University of Ljubljana is also supporting this program, and we are also very willing to host one or several Ukrainian scholars. And another example, and this will be the last one, but the last one I mentioned, but of course not the last one of those existing, but I wanted to mention it because this is a non-residential fellowships. And one of the first problems or challenges that I will be talking about with Ukrainian scholars is that not all of them could leave the country and can leave the country. And of course, one group are the people, are men in the age from 18 to 60 who have no other reason, like many kids or disability, to be excused from military service. So those people are banned from leaving Ukraine, and therefore they can't use in many cases all those fellowships and scholarships that are offered. So now one of the good solutions for that, or at least compromise, would be non-residential fellowship. But also, of course, it is important to say that it's not only male or men who cannot leave the country. There are also many Ukrainians, women who for some reason don't want to or cannot leave Ukraine, or because they want to be useful there, or because they have to take care of elderly people who don't want to leave, or for many reasons. And therefore for them, an option of non-residential fellowship, which would mean financial support, but also mentorship of senior scholars from abroad, and access to a university library online, access to academic journals that are incredibly expensive and is something totally unaffordable for Ukrainian scholars, could be a very good help and support for their ongoing research. Now, we haven't mentioned these initiatives, which all of them I find very useful and very helpful. I would like to mention some pitfalls that I already could observe and that we've been discussing with my colleagues, and that we probably could address in the future, because there is no way that the situation is changing or finishing very soon. So one is that I mentioned that not only men are not allowed to leave the country. Another thing with which, as I heard from a couple of male colleagues, they had to deal with, is that they do have the permission from the Ministry of Defense, but at the border, the border control doesn't let young men or older men, scholars or students, they do not allow them to cross the border, even though they actually have the paper. And this is, of course, partially personal factor, and partially it is a management on the places. And I've been talking to a good friend and colleague of mine who has now prestigious fellowship, PhD fellowship from one of the international programs. And I think that it's also something that a program could do and lobby and push at the level of discussion with the Ukrainian authorities to make sure that these men can actually leave the country and can go and continue their studies, so pursue some research. Not to mention that it is in principle problematic that a part of population is restricted with the freedom of mobility. But in these cases, when there is a official permission and there is a poor management of personnel at the border, this is something that probably our Western colleagues could also help. The complicated application procedures. So what many colleagues again mentioned, so we have all those programs, we have this database of vacancies, of fellowships where people can apply to. However, very often this application procedure is not really adjusted for the current situation. And when you have a scholar at risk, somebody who has to still teach during the airstrikes, alarms, somebody who has to take care of children, or somebody who also volunteers a lot, it's very difficult and stressful for them to, for example, draft a full, good, strong research proposal for 2,500 words. Of course, we understand the need for academic and scientific rigor, that people who go to the best universities, they should, have qualifications. But at the same time, I do believe that certain things are to be taken in consideration, and some complicated long-term application procedures are not the best solution right now. So certain things could have worked better. Then, surprisingly, universities are not prepared to host foreign researchers. And what I mean by that, as myself, as a foreign researcher who had quite a nomadic life and changed several countries in more peaceful time, I can say that bureaucratic procedures at places vary very much from country to country, and how the university is prepared to help a scholar with this also varies largely. So there are some universities which, hold your hand and help you with everything, and there are some universities which basically throw you into the cold water of local bureaucracy, and you have to deal with each step on your own. And this can be, again, it is already stressful when you are just a normal person, like, ordinary person changing the country. But it is double stressful if you fled the country with 2 suitcases, kids, and a cat. You don't speak the language, and the environment in which you operate is also not always friendly. While on the one hand, of course, Ukrainian people met this warm support, friendly volunteers, a lot of solidarity through Europe, there was also, there were also cases of discrimination, of bullying sometimes, like language barriers. For example, here in Ljubljana, when I went to the Migration Authorities Service to apply with my documents, I was told by people who work there, they don't speak any other language than Slovenian. And I know that it is not true. I know that all of them speak English quite well, and they actually spoke English to me half a year ago when I came the first time. So now the policy for some reason has changed. They decline speaking any language except Slovenian. And this is the department that works with foreigners. And, okay, Slovenian is a Slavic language, but it is still very different from Russian or Ukrainian. And if we look at other countries, the situation is even more challenging. So all these bureaucratic and language barriers are very stressful, and lead to the situation when people give up and they just don't want to apply for anything, and that they don't want to proceed and go further because they feel hopeless and helpless. I cannot stress much enough when how more challenging situation is for scholars who arrive with children or who are with children and have to take care about their safety, about application to local kindergartens, schools, teenagers with their teenager puberty crisis, and so on and so that. With this all already again in peaceful time, it is very difficult to combine normal academic career, which is quite demanding. And it is to say that in Ukraine, academic career is also challenging even in peaceful times because of quite low salaries and very high very demanding conditions, when you have a lot of lecturing, a lot of teaching, and a lot of bureaucratic pressure too. And with this, also running a family is complicated and challenging. But this kind of makes it twice, 3 times, 4 times more difficult for these people. And again, some women might sacrifice their academic career just to make sure that their kids feel all right. Another thing is lack of understanding. So what I observe is that people who manage to find fellowships quickly, people who were accommodated quickly by some universities are, not surprisingly, people who already were well connected with Western academia. And it's still very challenging for them to But for people who just arrived and who do not understand how the system works, how the hierarchy works, whom you can address, where you can go, where the money are, how one applies for funding for a conference, how one applies for this or that, access. Without this knowledge, people are often left on their own, and it happens also with other refugees. So once there is this idea that once you get your basic needs covered, then you can function on your own. But it is so, of course, but it takes much more time. And certain things, some universities are very not inclusive in the sense of the language, and this is again sometimes problem of resources. Sometimes it's a principal position. I know that I was told by my colleague in Belgium that the university with this, which is French, is very strict or kind of reluctant to do anything to people who don't speak French, which again can be understood, but creates then quite a challenge for Ukrainian scholars who don't speak French and who arrive to Belgium to apply for any of their programs and fellowships. Then one maybe less easy to put a finger on a thing, but that I also face in academic environment is patronizing attitudes. So on the one hand, right, there is one extreme is when the scholars are left or students are left alone, and basically there is expectation that you will figure out the things on your own. On the other hand, there might be instead the patronizing attitude when the scholars from Ukraine are being treated as less qualified, less prepared, less understanding, because they don't know this or that body of the literature, because they don't understand this or these nuances of Western of certain schools of thought or of certain systems. And this is, of course, also, again, in the situation of stress, makes you more sensitive, more insecure, more anxious about what it is. And then, of course, finally, is one big problem that I also faced is the overlooking the context. And what I mean is that, of course, we all, like Ukrainian scholars, all have very deep respect and appreciation for those Russian colleagues and in principle Russian citizens who do protest against the regime, who speak out against the war, who had to flee from the regime themselves. But sometimes the situation is that Ukrainian scholars are put on panels on the conferences with Russian colleagues who are actually not that, they have quite a, maybe not pro-Putin, but not very pro-Ukrainian point of view, who treat still Ukrainian scholars with some imperialistic attitudes and approaches, who can tell you, as I was told a couple of times, oh, why do you speak English? Just switch to Russian. Yeah, what's your problem? And when you hear this might be again small thing or something easy to deal with when you are coming from a peaceful context, but it is quite insulting and can hurt in the context like ours today. So more sensitivity is also something that is really needed. And of course, discussing Ukraine without Ukrainians. In 8 months, still what we see many events about Ukraine being hosted where there is no Ukrainian expert, no Ukrainian guest. And considering how many Ukrainians are now in Europe, this is very surprising. Now, I wanted to address quickly some challenges that haven't been mentioned, but that were voiced to me by many Ukrainian colleagues when I asked them on social media recently to help me to tell me what they want me to say today. And one was, of course, the mental health. And this is, again, of course, the problem of all Ukrainian displaced people and people who are now in Ukraine. But sometimes the scale of trauma is unimaginable. You cannot imagine it. I'm sorry. And one thing is that sometimes people cannot even, what my colleagues were telling me, sometimes they cannot even get up from the sofa and, write and fix their CV. So I wrote to a colleague asking her to pass me her CV to pass it to a potential employer. And she couldn't do that in 2 days simply because she felt like a wreck. She was crying and she said, I simply can't. So one thing that, I'm already starting to proposing some solutions. So one thing that with which we could probably help, or some volunteers or institutions, universities could help Ukrainian scholars first of all, to provide them with the psychological support, because sometimes even easiest actions, as it seems, right, it's a question of your survival, of your employment. Write your CV, like, I don't know, write a motivational letter. Even if you know how to do that, it can be incredibly difficult in the current condition because you can't put your life together anymore. So mental health support, maybe some, as I was offered by some of the colleagues, maybe to put in together one Ukrainian scholar with some Western volunteer who would like to help from another university, who would like to provide the very basic help with talking and helping to put up together very simple documents. Another thing, again, is this, I was mentioning this bullying, discrimination, and adaptation challenges. So people are, again, I think sometimes we don't realize how people feel, and people can start crying just when they hear fireworks or when they hear bottle opening. And sometimes when you walk on the street and somebody shouts you to the face, Putin is a great guy, in a normal life situation, you would ignore this and think, oh, that's a stupid person. In current situation, it doesn't feel like this. When people say hateful things to you. So psychological support and providing certain measures to protect Ukrainian scholars from discrimination and bullying would be very much needed. Then double or triple workshop. So what happens is that many scholars try and prefer to keep their work in Ukraine and also got some fellowships abroad. And then one problem is that actually some Ukrainian universities demanded from them to quit, which was one big challenge. But those universities who allowed them to do that, they keep, the lecture lot on these people. And so these people basically have to work. They work with their research project in Europe. They teach in Ukraine. They do some administrative things for Ukraine. And they also often take care of family. And this is something to deal with. And maybe we could discuss how this can be accommodated, what could be solutions, because on the one hand, we understand that all the employers kind of have the right to demand the quality performance from their employees. On the other hand, these are extreme conditions, and maybe this is something that, that can be responded in some flexible way to help to provide additional support. That's what I mentioned, threat to be fired unless a person goes back to Ukraine. And another thing that I wanted to mention coming from my colleague, and it's more for, of course, social science scholars, but also for every Ukrainian scholar, is that you all the time feel this responsibility to speak on behalf of the others. So now I deal with a similar challenge, speaking on behalf of other scholars. And I feel very anxious about this because I'm very much afraid not to mention something, to forget something, to misinform something. And at the same time, I'm afraid to be too emotional, not to be seen as the biased, as the subjective, as the hysterical, as the weak. And with this, and this comes from any topic. So basically, in addition to our everyday work, we also have this now work to represent Ukraine and Ukrainians in front of the West, to ask for Ukraine to be, to send us the weapon, to protect Ukrainians, to give to Ukrainians this or that. And this is a privilege, of course, to be able to do so, but this is also a lot of psychological burden because you feel no right for mistake. And this is something with what also many colleagues are living now. And of course, this is a shortened horizon of planning. And this is something, quite understandable in academia. Many of us live from grant to a grant, from one precarious position to another precarious position. Now, for Ukrainian scholars who have 6 months or 12 months research fellowship, who are still, lucky compared to those who didn't get any fellowship, this is still a condition of constant anxiety because 6 months is nothing. 6 months is a period in which you have to prepare another application for the next period. Otherwise, probably you will be kicked out of Europe. Maybe not, maybe yes, we don't know whether the protection status will be granted later. So this is something with which people also walk every day and, wake up every day. So this is my final slide and I'm finishing now. I wanted just to propose some ideas for further discussion and I think Mykhailo will, drop more. And this is, of course, one thing that I thought with which we could support people with peer support. So rather than inventing some very complex, large programs, which is also a good idea from big organizations, but we could also think about peer support, like, you know, mentoring or helping to each other. Choose one Ukrainian scholar to whom you could help, you know, and help them with this person in particular. Some integration programs. So maybe for some scholars who are it's very difficult for them to fit in the academia in Western academia for many reasons, maybe for the lack of knowledge of the language or for the specific field in which they are experts. For many of them, as they reported, the only job option provided by job center would be like to go and work in the warehouse or to clean, which is not to say that these are bad jobs, of course, but at the same time, wouldn't it be better at least to have, you know, some like half day or a third part of a day option of some integration programs where these people could learn some other skills to be with their high qualification, with their knowledge of certain fields, be then integrated to other organizations and firms. Solidarity networks, some of them are already running like Central Eastern European Scholars Network, but I hope that these networks can grow and we can look together for many options, how to help certain universities, groups of people, small organization, grassroots activists. Online courses, this would be, again, amazing. And this could be some very simple online courses, like how to set up a CV, language courses, academic English, which is very expensive and, you know, unaffordable for many Ukrainians, access to university libraries, accompanying people's applications or job search abroad, just helping with these very, very basic things. And also maybe mentoring or self-help, self-care groups. And also I had an experience of participating in one of those, and it was very good. It was very helpful in the first months of large-scale invasion, when you can come to a safe place and talk to people who will not be judgmental, where you can cry sometimes if you need it. But, you know, it's also empowering and also gives you a feeling of belonging. I will stop here. I thank you very much. Please feel free to reach me by email, by Facebook, whatever feels comfortable too. And I hope we will have a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so Mykhailo, if you will join in now.
First of all, I would like to thank you for this invitation and opportunity, because it's very important, especially after so full and interesting report which present Maryna. Even I don't know, even I'm not sure about can I add something after that, but I try. I think it wasn't, it will not be as a comment, maybe my opinion. So at the present, it will be general characteristic, because again, I'm not an expert in scholars program. I just like person who take part in this program from time to time. So at present, higher education in Ukraine is going through very difficult times. Attempts to introduce the European high school model have resulted in the old system being destroyed and the new one not being created. It's really a problem, because in some university completely destroy as a system. As for the research component, it was very weak and now almost no existent. Some scientific projects are founded, if at all, only if they are in the interest of the particular customer who is paying for this research. This is a rare phenomenon in itself, but even if it occurs, it concerns only high technology or medicine, those industries that are profitable. That is why most Ukrainian scientists rely on the research program of Europe and USA. And the pandemic and then the war made things worse. Education has lost its attractiveness and competitiveness, and it's a great problem because now so many students leave the university because it's not interesting for them. And research has become redundant too. Research has been carried out, if at all, exclusively through grant programs. With the beginning of the war, Ukrainian scientists found themselves in a deplorable situation because in the first months of the war, the little that still exists was lost. Many teachers and scientists had been dismissed because education and research institute in occupied territories had suspended activities, and education had been financed on a residual basis. On the other hand, however, Europe, the USA, and Canada have launched a lot of programs aimed to supporting Ukrainian scientists and students. These programs are diverse and promising, but they also have the advantage of accurate sense in initiatives related to the development of digital technologies. In my opinion, again, this imbalance is a big blow of scientific knowledge, but that is reality. With regard to the problem of and difficulties faced by Ukrainian scientists, including those outside Ukraine, including women, in my opinion, and Maryna told about this, about it. I believe that today part of that mainly of technical nature. What I mean here, first of all, is a lack of skills in working with resources on which to search and find such programs. This is a really problem. Also, it seems insignificant. Among the huge number of proposals, it's extremely difficult to find the optimal. This is often due to difference in the structure of Ukrainian education and scientific activity and European in particular. Ukrainian scientists often cannot find a branch close to his specialization because in European institutions, it's another rubric. Example include the programs of Alexandria Institute, the Faculty of Arts, which implemented a project incorporated element of study of penitentiary system. For me, it was very suddenly. There are also language difficulties. I agree with Maryna's speech. There are also explained by the long isolation of the scientific and teaching circle of Ukraine from European colleagues and international communication in general. The situation has only begun to change in recent years. And another problem is the organization one. There are significant differences in the entry procedures. In Ukraine, the initial stage of research do not have a high bureaucratic threshold. When starting a study, the scientist is guided at best only by hypothesis. And therefore, often the description of the upcoming research or project looks superficial. In Europe, however, quite detailed plans and algorithms of activities are often required at the beginning of the project. But legitimate question arises. What if the hypothesis doesn't hold or the research goes in a different direction? Did that mean that this original draft had not taken place and that it was necessary to change direction? Or it means the one must still insist on the hypothesis even if it has failed? So in a war situation, under stress, it's quite difficult to master unusual requirements and criteria, which leads to repeat disappointment in all capabilities. In addition, the scientific project is usual rise-alone activity, kind of leisure and a degree of space, predictability and rest. And with that, there is a very big shortage. So as a result, I would like to mark main problem can thus be identified like this. First, unusual definition of the purpose and subject of the research, making it difficult to find criteria for the selection of potential researchers. This leads of difficulties in detecting a potentially useful project. The second, language difficulties. And the third, bureaucratic problem, as I mentioned above. It seems to me that the combination of the described factors often leads to the fact that the programs do not work or Ukrainian researchers are not persistent. If we return to the description of the search situation in Ukraine, it should be noted that I mentioned earlier it is unacceptable. If you look at the website of Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine, we will see that for 2022-2023, it is planned. Firstly, I would like to show you share my screen, but after that, I think it is in Ukrainian, so you have to believe me. Ukrainian Slovak projects, 10 pieces, Ukrainian Lithuanian projects, 11 pieces, Ukrainian Chinese projects, 15 pieces, and that's all. Of course, this year is not indicative, but it still reflects a general trend. So this number catastrophically low in principle, but besides, there are no humanitarian projects. Of course, technological progress is not bad, but as the experience of the present days shows, the lack of humanitarian momentum makes the practice of total violation of human rights, discrimination, humiliation, and war acceptable today. And it's a big problem, in my opinion. It is not about only scientific activity, but in general problem of our society, not only I mean Ukrainian. Another problem is peculiar behind the sense, character of organization and initiation of scientific project. Now I talk about Ukraine, of course. In Ukraine, it is quite difficult to find an offer to cooperate. What I have mentioned above, telling about the complexity of search and orientation in the project proposed by Europe, in Ukrainian has its downside. The difficulty of found scientific project in which to participate. Again, the situation has changed in recent years, but it's still not acceptable. As for humanities and fields of activity, they today survive solely on social and human rights organization. This organization received grants to certain types of activities, usually with an expert component. It is them that humanistic scientists like psychologists, lawyers, historians, political scientists, economists, etc. take part. Of course, there are exceptions, and some researchers manage to find a way to do science. But I repeat, the general trend is that those scientists who are willing and ready to pursue science are looking for application, unfortunately, outside Ukraine. If we talk about present war times, we now have a paradoxical situation. In most universities and research institutions have been continuing to redundant scientists and teachers. With regard to existing research projects, if government funded, they have been suspended. Only project funded by Western donors continue to implement it. And finally, it can be said that during the war, Ukrainian science is on the verge of survival. But the worst thing is that, unfortunately, there is no support from the state. And this is a paradox. Although it is necessary to form a scientific and pedagogical elite, which after victory will conduct training and research, today this branch of activity is not at the center of the state interest. So that's all. Again, it's my opinion. It's not some rules, of course. And thank you very much. And I'm ready to ask some questions.